Ian Hartitz is a senior fantasy analyst at fantasylife.com who spent time with Action Network, NBC Sports, and Pro Football Focus. He's got the best meme game in the fantasy football industry, and he loves to remind you that every day is a great day to be great. These are his late round perspectives. It's so funny to me how we go all off season and we focus so much on the draft. And like, what percent do you think the draft matters? Like at the end of the day for your fantasy squad?
Yeah, you see the same numbers I do. Like, okay, there are a few rookies here and there, but they're almost all restricted to, the first two rounds, sometimes round three. And after that, we're pretty much playing the waiting game with it. So, those guys, the free agent acquisitions as well, like we just regularly overhype them. It's the guys we talk about all year long. And then we finally get to week one and we remember, oh yeah, guess what? The guys sitting on the couch playing with the same team they did last year, probably actually the ones that we're going to be talking about the most once we finally get into actual football, which we have, JJ. And thank God, man, I'm ready for it.
Thank God. Yeah. We did a draft back in, I don't know, when was that? I guess it was like early August with the Apex Writers League. That's something that I've already talked about on this show because I had Sigmund Bloom on with the first episode. I had Sean Siegel on with the second one. I'm going to ask you a question about your squad, but first, you and I, we had met before, but we rekindled and saw each other again in Canton at the Fantasy Football Expo, which was a great time. You mentioned that you had a history as being a player, which I didn't totally know about. You can get into detail or not get into detail. It's up to you. Think about that. Think about the fact that you had that background. I then thought about like what you are as an analyst and your process as an analyst. So do you think that background as a player, thinking about football in that way, a little bit differently than what a nerd like me might think about football, do you think that plays a role in like how you're approaching fantasy football and such?
Just to be clear, football player here. I like to think that I've done okay over I found a fiance to take the last name Hartitz, JJ. So I've done okay from that department over the years. But no, look specifically. And I mean, okay, I did play football, but I was at, Division III school, white, slow linebacker, had no, thoughts about ever going to the next level or anything. You get hit in the head a few times and, that kind of state of things. And all of a sudden the professional future definitely goes out the window. But if anything, man, I would just say that it's helped me over the years, being able to watch film and just not maybe jump to as many conclusions. And I think that's something anyone can learn without having played the game and stuff. But, just realizing like, okay, that blown coverage, the safety coming over the top to help while the cornerback was playing zone, everyone else was playing man, being able to kind of put together maybe where the mistake was made a little bit better than someone that hasn't actively got into it. But man, I think the whole film versus, analytics argument, which again, shouldn't be an argument. If the analytics aren't reflecting what we're seeing on the film, guess what? It's probably a bad stat or analytic, whatever you want to call it in the first place. So overall, just understanding of the game, I think it gave me a heads up. But again, if you're just trying to take all these resources we have available in the year 2023, doing your best to, ask good questions on a day-by-day basis, I think you'll be fine. So definitely miss those days, man. I mean, before I fell in love with fantasy football, was definitely more of just a quote unquote real life football fan. And, it was tough to get the juices flowing more than actually, getting out there and banging some helmets, but definitely fine to be, hitting the nerd streets like you these days in front of my computer.
The nerd streets, I love it. Yeah, man. I mean, like, I feel like we've had that like weird debate of film versus analytics. It started, I've been part of the fantasy football industry for about 10 years now. You've been around for a while too. And I feel like it was a lot more heated way back when. There was just a lot more divisiveness with like, and split between these two sort of factions. But at the end of the day, if you are approaching things from a numbers-driven perspective, you should at least be looking at what's going on so that you can talk intelligently about the game and vice versa to some degree. Like if you're strictly a film guy, I mean, at the end of the day, fantasy football is a numbers-driven game, right? It still matters to some degree to be able to dissect things in that way. So I think you're right, in the way that we probably should be approaching this. I always say sort of like lean into what you're good at too. I'm not going to pretend like I can break down film the same way that a Dane Brugler can whenever he's prospecting guys and stuff like that, right? But I can at least bring something to the table with some of the modeling that I've done and stuff like that. So, I think that's part of the thing too, is that it's okay to lean on other analysts whenever you're doing this stuff, because other guys are are better than you at what you're doing. Guys and gals. I just mean guys as in person in general, because clearly we have a female contingent here too that are analyzing this stuff.
Oh yeah, and JJ, just real quick, like, and you mentioned like Dan Brugler and yourself, man. Like your prospect model is freaking fantastic. Like I really do recognize kind of the biggest hole in my game as an analyst is just kind of the lack of knowledge about some of these rookie players. You know, it is tough for me to take every single Saturday off as well as the Sunday and try to enjoy some semblance of, you know, my family and friends not completely hating me during every single football season. So I definitely think, you know, from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense. But at the end of the day, man, like you and me, we're just so lucky to be able to go out here and do this every single day for our job. And I feel like if I'm not making an effort to watch every single football game, then I'm just, you know, not really doing what I need to do for the people that believe in me in that. So there was you know, he said a lot of wonky things over the years, but Conor McGregor had a quote a couple years ago. We were saying like, you know, your lack of discipline is a insult to everyone that believes in you. And that's kind of what I go by with that, where, you know, when we're talking for a living like we do, man, one of the easiest ways that you cannot say something really stupid about a game, not say a player sucked because of that 2-catch, 15-yard scoreless performance, when if you watch the game, you see all the overthrows and missed opportunities. Again, piece of the puzzle, maybe not the biggest piece, but it is a piece nonetheless. So why not try to do what we can with it?
Yeah, man. The fact that we are doing this for a living, like I try not to lose sight of that each day that I'm doing this. I mean, we're recording this podcast, and you know, it's crazy that we're able to do this in the first place. But it's also one of those things where like I bring people on like you or like Siegel last week or Bloom, and everyone's coming, and this is what Late Round Perspectives is all about. People are coming forth with these different outlooks and perspectives on things, right? And you're able to learn, and you're also, I'm listening to you guys talk and I'm like, I got to get better, man. I got to keep getting better at this stuff because I can't lag behind, because that's not fair to people who are listening, people who are relying on us, all that stuff. So love that outlook for sure. When you're entering a fantasy draft, you and I play in a lot of leagues together. Do you have sort of like a structure in mind of how you're going to build your roster, or are you looking at the board? Are you reacting based on what's gone on in the draft, or is it a little bit of both?
I think it's a little bit of both. You know, I've had, and I'm sure we all wrote this at one point or another, kind of like our draft strategy for this year, 10 tips. And I think any of them, 0 RB, hero RB, super hero RB, whatever the hell you want to call the new hip thing, they can all work in the right context, in the right format, in the right draft. But one of the things I've tried to really just note is, you know, trying to be like Bruce Lee and being like water and just being flexible enough in your drafts to take advantage of some of that value that falls to you. I mean, again, you mentioned the Apex Experts League a little bit earlier, and I took Josh Allen in the middle of round 3. Didn't draft a lot of Josh Allen in round 3 throughout the fantasy season, but when I was in a draft where my wide receivers were gone, DK Metcalf went one pick before that. Throughout the offseason, him and Calvin Ridley have really been where I've been drawing that line at wide receiver. And then the running backs have been gone, you know, Tony Pollard, Josh Jacobs, Saquon Barkley. Once we kind of get past that group, it also gets tougher. So at some point in August, I was just looking at it and I decided I wasn't going to play this, you know, wide receiver running back chase with the rest of the league. I'm going to draft on my terms. And for me, those elite QBs in round 3, once the right tier breaks occur at RB and wide receiver, became the times when I was ready to go down that road. So again, it's not the sexiest answer to just say, you know, go with the flow of the drafts. But I do think, you know, having the overall understanding of, you know, an 18-round draft and where you do have those tier cliffs at different spots, it enables you to, again, take that value that you'll find only in specific drafts and then fix up the rest later.
Yeah, I sort of think about drafting and kind of reacting to drafts and like the information that we throw out there all off season long and people consuming this information and sort of using that info for their drafts. I think it's very easy to walk away and be like, man, I know way more than I needed to know in order to draft this 15-player roster, right? I only needed to know about like 30 guys probably, because those are the the things that I'm deciding as the draft is going on. But the way that I see it is the more information you have on these players and on these situations, the more reactive and nimble you're going to be while you're drafting. And I really think this is evident with prospecting and as it pertains not just to dynasty, but to redraft, right? Where, you know, someone like Trey Palmer right now, where you don't need to add Trey Palmer more than likely off waivers right now today in like a normal 12-team league. But at the same time, it's good to know that, let's say, you know, my prospect model liked Trey Palmer a little bit more than where he was being drafted. And so, you know, that the time that he were to get, if he were to get some work, you know that that's the time to pounce on the waiver wire, hopefully quicker than what your league mates might do. Now, you know, you'll sometimes get some prospects breaking out and it being really, really obvious. It's not always just like kind of creepily getting there where he's like, getting more snaps. Maybe not. Maybe the production's not totally there yet. But I do think that like this idea of being reactive, you say that it's sort of a lame answer, but I think it's a very real answer. And it goes back to just having this like inherent knowledge of fantasy football and of these players. That's what allows you to be very, very nimble while drafts are going on and understanding tiers, as you said. I don't know about you, but like, and you mentioned it just now, but like, it just seemed like there was an obvious mid-third round break this year where things just got super, super flat. You mentioned, sounds like your cutoff was like that Calvin Ridley, DK Metcalf range. I would agree for the most part. I think that maybe you can make an argument for a couple other wide receivers or like a Ramondre if you wanted to reach a little bit. But there's players that, they were iffy enough where that's where the line just seemed to really be drawn very obviously with the quarterback position. I'm assuming you didn't go after second round quarterbacks then this season. Is that correct?
Nah. And look, I will say I've tried to test. I mean, look, you know how it is now with these best ball streets. It's fantastic, especially for guys like ourselves trying to do the content creator side of things and just getting like hundreds of reps without, committing to waiver wires and all this shit throughout the entire season is so valuable, man. Because going through all this stuff, I'll see people arguing about, maybe like how is Miles Sanders like the RB19 and stuff? And for me, it's like, you can't argue about the positional rankings and that's part of it, sure. But for me, it's always like, okay, when I'm taking Miles Sanders into round 6 of drafts, like what's the opportunity cost? Exactly. What's my roster now going to look like taking a running back there? Not necessarily like Miles Sanders himself, just nameless, faceless fantasy assets over here, JJ. But again, so just really getting those reps in has allowed me to see not only the tiers and everything, but also just see like where things can go right and where things can go wrong. So early on in the offseason, trying to do some of those, especially Kelsey and, Mahomes stacks in round 1, round 2, really didn't like how my roster looked at the end of the day. Yeah. And no, I can't predict the future. Maybe that will end up being the, we're going to try to predict the future, I should say, but maybe that will end up being the optimal stack, but just feels so light at either running back or wide receiver when I'm going QB in round 2. Not quite for me. But again, just one of those things in terms of like, how do you develop the draft strategy? A lot of it is reps. And I don't think you need to be going out there and playing in 10, $1,000 high stakes leagues or anything, but you don't have to. Again, just entering a couple handfuls of these $3, $5 puppies on Underdog or something like that, man. So invaluable out there in those streets. I've likened it before. I don't know if you've ever seen the Netflix show Queen's Gambit. It was really hot a couple years ago, but this ace like chess master, she'd be laying in bed at night and she could look up at the ceiling and all of a sudden the pieces would appear and she's just kind of going through all these moves in her mind. Like after I've kind of gotten 10, maybe 12 fantasy drafts under my belt during a given offseason, I really feel like you can again start to not only see like what I'm choosing between in round 2, round 3, but then how that's going to impact the rest of your draft and what sacrifices you're going to have to make later. So again, maybe there's not one size all fits all, strategy out there. And, the answer might just be hard work in all facets of the game, man. What a wild thought that would be.
Yeah, right. So instead of you laying in bed, looking at the ceiling and envisioning chess, you're on your phone drafting best ball drafts and doing best ball drafts. Yeah.
Yeah. My fiance hates me, but it is what it is.
So you did get Josh Allen in that Apex league. You stacked him though with Diggs, which also made it an easier kind of route to go because you at least get that upside, if that stack really, really pans out. And obviously it's one of the best looking stacks you can find. In a draft like that draft is historically insanely wide receiver heavy, like unbelievably wide receiver heavy. In a draft like that, do you ever get afraid of falling behind at that position? And that would then force you to maybe go with like an Amari Cooper or something like that instead of a Josh Allen? Or are you okay with kind of sticking to your board a little bit because you know that later in the draft, when people kind of stop drafting wide receivers as heavily, you might be able to find value that way?
Definitely something to think of, and you aren't kidding about that room. I remember the first time I was in it, like I was taking all these great running back values early, like, oh, what the hell? Like I thought these were supposed to be experts, and I found out very quickly what exactly you guys go ahead and do over here in the Apex. But I will say having Diggs and then Jalen Waddle come back to me in round 2, like allowed me to go off the street just a little bit. But, getting Mike Williams in round 4 went ahead and made up for that in a hurry. But yeah, man, drafted Najee Harris in round 5.
That was crazy.
I don't like it, man. It was crazy. I remember it was like 2 a.m. I fell asleep on the couch. I woke up and I was like, oh, I'm up. Might as well get this done. And I woke up the next day. And I was like, Ian, what the hell were you thinking, man? So this is one of maybe like 3 or 4 leagues, like including best ball, which is, now we're talking out of probably 200 total leagues I did this year, that I ended up with Najee Harris. So at the same time, like to say, don't hate the player, hate the ADP.
Right.
Round 3, Najee Harris is ridiculous. Round 5, I can get around a little bit more. But yeah, man, it is one of those things with wide receiver where particularly this league, and I don't know about you, man, but overall this year, like my strategy in more leagues than not, try to get 5 of those top 45, maybe top 50 wide receivers inside of the first 9 rounds, because I get it. We do have our late round targets after that, but I just feel like, in the middle and late stages of the draft, that's where I want to be throwing my darts at these handcuff RB types who are one injury away from being must-start options, not the Van Jeffersons and the Alec Pierces of the world where you're just never really going to feel good about starting them anyway. So definitely in this league, got to go heavy with the wide receivers early. But, maybe I'm just late to the party here with 0 RB, but I really felt like this year, 0 RB or maybe getting 1 or 2 early before just going on a run of them was the proper roster construction.
Yeah, I want to throw the caveat out there that we're recording this on Wednesday this week. So this is before the Thursday night game and before Van Jefferson and Alec Pierce inevitably go off this weekend.
That's how it works. That's how it works.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So the Najee Harris thing's interesting because I'm with you on the fade train, like in the 3rd round. Like it doesn't do it for me when the ceiling just seems very capped from a receiving perspective and from like a Jalen Warren perspective. Do you have any fear with a player like Harris that, because a lot of fantasy analysts are not on Najee Harris this year. Like it's not a unique take to say that you're fading Harris or you haven't gotten Harris that much. In the 5th round, I'm with you. That was a great value. Like I would have gotten him. I was in the later parts of the draft, so I wasn't able to snag him there, and I wasn't going to get him in the early 4th. But in the 5th round, that's obviously really, really good value. And as you said, don't hate the player, hate the ADP. Is there any fear in your mind that we could all be wrong with Najee Harris and that this is like another, I don't want to say it's a Josh Jacobs situation because, Jacobs not only was going later in drafts, but, I think that Jacobs obviously had far less competition last year than what Najee's facing. But do you think that there is an out here for Harris to be like a top 5 back, or do you feel pretty confident that, he's going to be at best like a low end RB1 or something like that?
I do think he could get back to low-end RB1 numbers. The problem is, man, like as much as he wasn't really good last year from an efficiency basis and he wasn't good as a rookie on an efficiency basis, like adding Jalen Warren in there, I mean, we've seen it over the years, man, from Le'Veon Bell to the D'Angelo Williams, like James Conner. Stephen freaking Ridley used to get an every down workhorse role like in week 17 back in the day. Mike Tomlin, self-pronounced featured runner type of guy. And that's what Najee Harris was in 2021. I mean, the RB2 in expected PPR points per game behind only Derrick Henry. So guess what? When he was inefficient and the offense wasn't that good, that was okay. He still fell down to low-end RB1 territory. But when you add Jalen Warren in there, legit taking those fantasy-friendly pass-down snaps and, yes, not taking over the backfield, but turning it more into a 70-30 situation as opposed to the literally 90-10 situation we were looking at in 2021, it's enough to make Najee, again, very risky at that 3rd-round valuation. Because, again, now we're talking about more of a borderline RB1 workload where if he's going to falter with that, now we're falling deep into the RB2 depth. So just depends on if this, offensive line can make life a little bit easier. They did obviously add, the 1st-round tackle there. So definitely trying from that point. And then can Kenny Pickett give them some semblance of scoring upside, which I know, just the preseason, but I'd rather the guys be good in preseason than shitty, and 5 touchdowns and 5 drives, good signs there. So I see the pathway, and, I see the pathway for a lot of guys like Najee Harris and James Conner and Cam Akers, these inefficient, hopeful workhorse running backs and probably bad offenses. And that really was the other reason why I wasn't drafting a ton of Najee. Didn't see why he should be getting prioritized ahead of all those other guys who, again, I thought fit a very similar archetype.
Yeah, and I would argue that there's guys in the dead zone this year that have just more inherent upside than he does. Like, I think that you could make the argument pretty easily that like a David Montgomery has more upside than Najee Harris because he has that contingent upside of if Jahmyr Gibbs gets banged up, then Montgomery's all of a sudden a true 3-down back and one of the better offenses in the league, playing in a dome, all that good stuff. And we know that
are they still one of the better offenses in the league, JJ? I'm starting to wonder about that.
Are you? Talk to me about it. Are you down on this Lions offense this year?
So, okay. I know they were number 5 last year. That happened. No one can take that away from them. But it's not like every single year we see this 100% repeat in the top 10 scoring
Sure,
offenses.
sure.
In fact, since 2000, 4.9 on average repeat as a top 10 scoring group from the next season. And if you look at it last year, there were only 3 top 10 scoring offenses that also had a bottom 10 scoring defense, leading to some of that shootout friendly, fantasy friendly, game script, Lions, Vikings, and Seahawks. So when I read the top 10 scoring offenses from last season, again, realizing that historically we should expect about 5 of these teams to fall off. Chiefs, Eagles, Cowboys, Bills, Lions, 49ers, Vikings, Bengals, Seahawks, and Jaguars. I mean, we can't love every single offense in the league, man. And as great as we saw Ben Johnson calling those plays, I do tend to think that the Jims and Joes outweigh the X's and O's at a certain point. This would not be the first time we saw a play caller have a lot of success in his first year doing it, but then defenses catch up a little bit more. And as much as I love the Sun God, okay, Jared Goff, let's not pretend like it's been 5 straight years of just lights out play by him one time after another. Maybe Jahmyr Gibbs and Sam Laporta are going to be fantastic pros. They are rookies. And as we kind of talked about at the beginning of the show, man, expecting rookies to come out of the gate flying high and stuff, it's a lot to ask for. Dave Montgomery, I see what you're saying. Bears fans listening, I think we can agree it's not exactly someone that's been knocking on the top 5 real life RB door.
Sure.
And then it's like, what are we doing here? Old man Marvin Jones, Josh Reynolds. The fact they couldn't add any sort of wide receiver depth in this room behind the Sun God, man, it's just brutal for me. So I think there's a lot more questions that need to be asked about this Lions team. And now they get to play this banged up Chiefs team on Thursday night. I'm sure they all obviously already had some, crazy upset. I'm not sure when people are going to be listening to this. So 35 points from Goff on Thursday nights can make me look really stupid once you're hearing this. But again, man, a lot of emphasis on the rookies. And I just think, did you watch the Lions last year and go, man, if they just had some better running backs, we'd even be more set?
Yeah.
I think they could have a steep little fall off here.
Look, I think that's a very fair take. Very, very fair take. And the other offense in that group that I'll throw out there, this is apparently just going to be our stuff that's been in our dome that we haven't necessarily fired off, confidently yet. But I'm going to say San Francisco also part of that group. They were unbelievably unsustainable in the way that they scored touchdowns with Brock Purdy last year when he became starter. They averaged 3.83 offensive touchdowns per game in the regular season when he was starter. That's 6th best of any team since 2011. That's not going to maintain. That's not going to keep up. I just don't see that necessarily happening. I just think there's a lot of volatility to Purdy. I think Purdy's fine. It's like a best ball quarterback. I drafted a lot of them. And, I'm not saying that he's not a target. And I'm not even saying that some of these 49ers players aren't targets. But I do think that there is some volatility with an offense like that too. But I do think, you naming those offenses, you talking through those offenses, Detroit's got to be up there, as one of those teams. It's sort of like how we look at the playoffs each year, how there's turnover in the playoffs and we got to pinpoint which teams are going to be in, which ones aren't going to be in, the following season. I could see that happening with Detroit. My main point with a guy like Montgomery, you could say even like a Rashad White, who's going to probably have a decent receiving role. There's a lot of players that I think could match a Najee Harris median projection, right?
Yeah.
Or they could also match a ceiling projection if things sort of break their way, properly. Like a Rashad White, everyone will sit there and say the offense sucks, and there's no way that White is able to be a top, 12, 13, 14 back. But I would argue that the receiving work would be there in droves, and that's the way he could be a very, very highly used back in that backfield, and that's the way that he gets there just purely on volume alone. And maybe that offense, maybe Baker Mayfield's a little bit better than we expect. But yeah. I just think that where Najee's gotten drafted this offseason is sort of where the dead zone kind of clearly starts for me, at least. It's like around that Najee, maybe ETN tier, and it just sort of remains fairly flat from a ceiling perspective. There's just not many guys that, I'm going to get fired up about in that range compared to guys that I'm going to get as RB3s, RB4s. So I'm with you on Najee. I just think it's going to be interesting because if Najee hits this year, if Najee's like a top 6 running back, people are going to hate fantasy football analysts because there's a lot of fantasy football analysts that have not been on Najee Harris. Another player I really want to talk about, because I've gotten some hate for this take and my stance on Deshaun Watson. But you wrote, Deshaun Watson is my single favorite quarterback target in fantasy football if fading the true early round options. So I want to ask you to expand on that a little bit because, I personally have Deshaun Watson in the same tier as a Trevor Lawrence this year. And it's mostly because I'm looking at it from a ceiling perspective. And, someone will say, I think median projection and my projections show that Trevor Lawrence looks better than Deshaun Watson, but it's really hard for me to get away from what we saw from Watson the last full season he played. So sell, not me necessarily, but sell others on why you like Deshaun Watson this year.
I mean, last year was horrendous. We all saw it. Same EPA per dropback as Zach Wilson. Says it all right there. But even with that, man, again, 6 games of being terrible, 4 other seasons of being one of the best fantasy football quarterbacks we've ever seen. Include last year. Go ahead. Watson remains one of 5 quarterbacks ever averaging 20-plus fantasy points per game for their career. Last time we saw him play a full season, he led the league in passing yards, and we know he's not a safe bet, but we know he can give us 500-plus rushing yards and a handful of touchdowns on the ground during any given year as well. So if I asked myself this question earlier in the offseason, if Watson just didn't play football last year, didn't have to, come in, didn't practice with the team, comes back towards the end of the year, they were still running the, Nick Chubb, Jacoby Brissett sort of offense there. Like, where would Watson just be going if the last time we saw him was leading the league in passing yards? And I think you're right. I think he'd be right in there in that T-Law, Justin Herbert, maybe even Joe Burrow tier of quarterbacks. So the fact that you can get that sort of talent, a lot of times, man, in round 8, every now and then, round 9, it's just like if you're asking yourself, and, shout out Patrick Carrain, not that he needs any shout outs. He's got enough millions of dollars to be just fine without my kind words, but really smart thing that Pat said earlier in the offseason was just, asking yourself in these rounds, like, what can I get here that I can't get later? And again, we talked earlier, I'm not completely against taking a Josh Allen or a Jalen Hurts early if the right guys are off the board and everything. But I have found myself in that part of the draft leaning towards the alpha wide receivers that I know aren't going to be there in round 8 or 9, because I do think the best version of Deshaun Watson, it could very likely, man, be right back in that round 3, round 4 conversation next year. So we've seen in the offseason, Elijah Moore, Cedric Tillman coming to the fold. They have made an effort to spruce up those weapons. And, I did notice, and again, just preseason, but schematically, maybe we can get some takeaways there. I mean, they ran the most empty in the entire NFL in the preseason, and it wasn't particularly close. And their pass play rate, man, ranked 7th overall after being 24th last year. So I just kind of threw that out there in a tweet, and I was like, maybe it matters, maybe it doesn't. And very smart real-life analyst Robert Mays actually came knocking on my Twitter door and went ahead and said that he does think the Cleveland one matters because it really matches everything he heard in some of those training camp circles. So guess what? That Texans team that Deshaun Watson, again, led the NFL in passing yards on, they were horrendous. Like, that was a 4-12 really bad football team. But when you have a dual threat talent like Watson under center, we've seen it time and time again with your own freaking late round QB strategy, just how much of a cheat code those guys can be. It's the, rushing quarterbacks and receiving running backs are the 2 archetypes that just break people's minds sometimes that don't follow fantasy, because they're cheat codes in our game, but maybe not quite as good in real life. So, lost kind of in the Watson season last year was his rushing yards were actually a little bit up on a per game basis. I want to say 3 of those 6 games had a game total of like 40 because we get that token, shitty Cleveland weather in December. So again, a lot of outs for a player, and I'm just at the end of the day going to side with the 4-year sample size versus the 6-game one.
Yeah, look, I'm with you, full agreement. And part of it, too, is if you're in a shallower league, it's going to be easier to take on Watson if he does end up being last year's Watson, right? If he just ends up just being bad, if you're in a shallow league, you can make up for that a little bit easier. If you're in a deeper league, then you might want to platoon him. You might want to think a little bit differently about the position. But I'm with you. I mean, I'm shooting for upside. I'm chasing upside at quarterback when I'm not drafting the truly elite guys, because the opportunity cost when you get in those middle rounds is just not significant enough to not do that. And so I'm with you. I think Watson, he too is one of my single favorite quarterback target this year. Now, speaking of the Browns, I've been in on Elijah Moore. I've also been in on Donovan Peoples-Jones this year. I think that they're both fine to draft. I know that you've been into DPJ. Does that mean that you're out on Elijah Moore? Is there any concern that you have about Elijah Moore, given the fact that I think we got to be realistic here? He's probably not going to play in 2 wide sets, at least to start the year. I mean, I think DPJ is going to be playing the perimeter, and Elijah Moore is going to play the more natural slot role that he played in college. Now, the weird thing about Moore is that he's actually really good rookie season playing on the outside. He played a pretty low snap rate in the slot his rookie year, and that's what got me really, really excited, because I liked him as a prospect, but I was like, maybe he'll just be a slot guy in the NFL, even though my model likes him a good bit. And then he goes to the Jets, and his rookie season, everything looks great on paper. And he looked good too, and he was beating corners on the outside on the perimeter despite his frame. And then last year happens, which you can kind of write off because it was such a weird season for him in the Jets. But I do think that we're likely going to see him in a slot role. Does that worry you about him being a consistent fantasy asset? And does that make you just lean into DPJ a little bit more?
I will say the running back stuff with Elijah, I do think is important, especially with them not adding any other of these, potential pass down backs that could take that away. Maybe a healthy Jerome Ford does. Like, Lord knows, I'd love that thanks to how much I've drafted him as well, around 16th or 18th. I have drafted all these Browns a ton, man. Njoku a lot too in round 10, because I think there's a pretty steep drop off at tight end after that point. So I hear you there, and I'm not going to sit here and call, Elijah Moore just the next Deebo Samuel, because we say that for every freaking wide receiver that ever gets a carry. But how about like a mid 2010s like Randall Cobb? Give me like 10 to 15 carries per season. Give me some funky, just designs. Like, the Jaguars did that with Christian Kirk a good amount last year. CeeDee Lamb had some reps like that as well. Like, just because you're getting some snaps as a running back doesn't mean you're just now this gadget player that can't get it done. I'm fine with my players getting those gadget touches. No one complains about it for Deebo. It's only if it comes at the loss of a true starting role. And as much as, again, maybe in 12 personnel, we're not going to see that as often, with the amount that they're potentially scheming up the more targets per out run for Elijah, I think it'll be okay. So at the end of the day, man, I just pulled up my best ball exposure, and number one drafted wide receiver, easily Deontay Johnson. Like, come on. But
I'm with you.
Three-way tie for second: Rashad Bateman, DPJ, and Elijah Moore. I drafted them in the exact same amount of drafts together. So a lot of stacks that have been Watson, then Elijah Moore right after, and then you go ahead and get DPJ later. So yeah, man, I really did come around more so on Elijah heavy in August. Once we saw not only was he, again, just getting a new fresh start, but being featured the way he was, being a true every down starter. And again, if I'm not every down starter, but you know what I mean, just being a starting wide receiver in the offense. And if I'm that high on Deshaun Watson, well, I should probably be pretty high on his pass catchers as well. So, just getting incredibly invested in the Cleveland Browns. What could go wrong here for me and my finances? But end of the day, man, again, I just think if you look at the Browns offense, pretty much everyone other than Chubb and Cooper are being priced far closer to their floors than their ceiling. And DPJ in particular, man, I would say him, Jaden Reed, and Devontae Parker were the three just late round wide receivers, where if I was going to go out of my way to get one, it'd be those guys. Because, I'm curious what kind of your prospect model said about DPJ, because as much as Michigan keeps kicking my Buckeyes asses recently, there was a time before 2020 when, it was just a weird run first offense, and we were seeing guys like DPJ, like Nico Collins be really hyped up recruits, but just maybe not get as many opportunities as they might have in a different offense. So what did you think of DPJ coming out?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of saw him the same way that I saw like a Nico, where it's a very easy like comp and sort of situation to look like, but they're both sort of that archetype, can play the perimeter well. Nico can play that X, and DPJ able to do the same. And I they weren't like stellar prospects per se, but they weren't bad. They were totally fine. And the nice part is that we've seen growth from both of those guys, so far in the league. And so I bought into DPJ probably later in the process, because I was a little bit worried about Cedric Tillman at first, even though I wasn't super, super high on Tillman as a prospect. I was just more concerned about how the Browns might want to deploy him, because I think that if you're going to look at like a redundant asset, it would be Tillman to DPJ as opposed to Tillman to Elijah Moore, obviously.
For sure.
And so, but yeah, I mean, where DPJ has gone in drafts, it just makes a ton of sense, because I'm with you. I'm buying into this Browns passing attack. And I think we will see a lot of 11 personnel. And so that's part of the reason why I'm cool with going more. I also think that we always talk about these like specific roles that these guys play. Like we'll say, oh, this guy's a slot guy, or this guy, is the X or whatever. But guys move around formations all the time. Yeah. When you're in 12 personnel, Elijah Moore can still be on the field with Amari Cooper. It's not like this is a locked in, always going to happen kind of thing. And so, I think that just throwing darts, getting pieces of this offense, just makes a lot of sense from a process standpoint. The guys that you just named too, guys that I've been drafting in a lot of my best ball drafts too. So it looks like we're riding together this year, man. Hopefully my boy Jaden Reed comes through, because I think that people have been sick of hearing his name on this podcast. Speaking of this podcast, one of the reasons why I really wanted to start late round perspectives is because I throw out takes all week, right? I'm giving takes on who I like, who I don't like, why I do, why I don't. And I don't have any other perspective on these things that I'm saying, right? I am the one who's editing this show, and then I publish the show, and no one else is listening to it before it goes out into the world. And it's kind of a thrilling experience, right? Because I'm like, how are people going to react to these things that I'm saying? But at the same time, I don't know how other analysts are really reacting to the thing. Like, I might be seeing something that literally no other analyst in the space is seeing. And that's a little bit weird too. So I wanted to start the show to just kind of have conversations, not just about like your processes, your background and how you view this game, but also, get reactions to some of the insane stuff that I might be saying on this show. And one of the insane things that I said this week was with Derrick Henry. I had Derrick Henry as a sell candidate on my 15 transaction show. Now, I should say from like a positional ranking perspective, I have Derrick Henry right at market because it's kind of hard to be overly high or overly low on him within the running back position because we've had these situations where like Breece Hall dropped, Ramondre Stevenson dropped, Jonathan Taylor dropped, and it just sort of has naturally pushed Derrick Henry into a spot where almost everyone has him in that same spot, right? My thing is, in drafts, I was just much more keen in getting these wide receivers early instead of necessarily going after Derrick Henry. And so, he was sort of an avoid for me, but not like a hardcore, you got to avoid him at all costs kind of player. Because if you wanted to go with more of like a hero RB approach, totally understand with a guy like Henry. But I had him as a sell in the 15 transactions podcast earlier this week because their schedule to start the year is just really, really rough. They might only be a favorite in one game across their first like 5 or 6. And that's a little bit frightening given Derrick Henry and the way that he, operates. So I just need to ask you, am I a moron? Am I an idiot because Derrick Henry's owned me in the past. Like he has completely destroyed me in the past. I think there was one season where I was right with him. Every other season, I've basically been wrong with him. And I feel like now, after having that sell transaction, that's going to be something that people latch onto, even though I'm not really saying you got to sell him. I'm saying that I could see his value dropping from where we are right now today to where we might be week 5, week 6.
You're just playing percentages, man. And he is at that RB age cliff. He's at the cliff that we see. Again, a shout out to Tage Seth doing awesome stuff over at Summer Sports, a new company that Eric Eager is heading up and other great guys. But one thing Tage has found that, again, you're rushing just expected yards like per carry over expectation, rushing yards per carry over expectation. That's what I was looking for. When you look at running backs past 1,500 career professional carries, Lord knows if we started including Henry's, high school and college touches in there, but just professionally, man, it really is a steep decline. And as much as maybe we see an exception like an Adrian Peterson, and to be fair, to this point, a Derrick Henry, no, I just feel like you're playing the odds, man. I don't blame you for doing that. And specifically with Henry, like we have seen that rushing expectation really fall off. And guess what? As someone that doesn't necessarily, we talked about, trying to cover our bases, maybe with not being able to cover each and every intricacy of the game. Like, yeah, I do rely generally, just directionally, I should say, on PFF offensive line ranks because, I'm not grading every single right guard and left tackle's, ability. I'll give them some credit for that. And it's the PFF's reigning 32nd ranked offensive line. I believe they're 32nd again going into this year. And like the major reason why Henry was able to keep on keeping on last year, the rushing yards were great, but in full PPR, man, like we saw Jamal Williams score 17 touchdowns and still be like a low end RB2 per game. That's just life in full PPR scoring. And to see Derrick Henry like really smash his career high marks. I mean, 398 receiving yards, 206 was his previous career high. Then the receptions, 33 versus 19. I think Tajay Spears is going to come in and take a lot of that pass down work that, again, really, I think was a difference between Henry being this RB1 just bona fide dog last year and being maybe someone more like Dalvin Cook, not the worst running back in the world last year, but not someone that fantasy managers were thrilled to have on the squad by the end of the season. So I'm with you. I was drafting Henry at that one point in the offseason when we didn't have the Breece Hall issues quite yet. We didn't have Ramondre Stevenson. We didn't have the holdouts going on. So you could legit get like Tony Pollard and Derrick Henry at the round 2, round 3 turn. Yeah. Round 3, Derrick Henry, I was signing up for, but otherwise, I was missing it. But I will say, JJ, like this has the chance to go so incredibly wrong because they get the Texans in week 15 and week 17. So, if he's still on the field at that point, it's going to be problematic. But yeah, again, just, trying to go back to telling you guys that I do, kind of put my money in my drafts where my mouth is. Like number 1, highest drafted running back for me this year is Jaylen Warren. Number 2 is Tajay Spears, man. So even the whole, what surprised me too was like the Hassan Haskins news coming down, him having that really messy charge that ended up landing him on the commissioner's exempt list and now also being injured. Like that happened in Tajay's ADP. Like it took until late August for that to even start moving. So Tajay Spears, man, if someone's going to benefit from Henry being out, it's going to be the guy with no ACLs.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Look, we've seen some successes with no ACL players like Hines Ward. He doesn't have any ACLs. He had a near Hall of Fame career. But yeah, look, and not only that, but Tajay Spears. I was a little bit iffy on him as a prospect, not because the explosiveness wasn't there, it was pretty obvious, but the long term, the knee issues are at least a question, right? And then I also saw him more as like a potential complement as opposed to this full blown workhorse. But what we saw in the preseason, I mean, even if he is a compliment, that dude is fast. I mean, he is good. And so I have bought into Tajay Spears a little bit more after even seeing that. But I'm obviously with you with Henry. I know that people are listening to this right now and they're just like, he's built different though. Like it's just that's just it's a comeback that you can't even deny and say that it's wrong, right? Like the dude is built different. And so it's frightening to say that I'm underweight. I still drafted him a little bit, but I'm underweight on Derrick Henry. And then I had that transaction. It's frightening. I get it. But I think logically, there's at least logic there, even though Derrick Henry has broken logic throughout his career.
It's a joke where if we're kind of taking a page out like the Space Jam playbook, aliens invade and we got to play like one football game to decide the fate of the human race. And can we pick Derrick Henry? No, because he's coming off the spaceship with the aliens already. Yeah, right. So yes, again, it's terrifying. And I said before, Adrian Peterson was an exception. It would make sense if Derrick Henry is an exception too. But again, when you add the context of the O-line and the scoring upside of the offense and the day 2 running back addition, too much for me to again fire him up with regularity in the first or second round.
Yeah, and he hasn't maintained his insane rushing efficiency. It's not like that's been, last couple of years has not been the same Derrick Henry that we saw when he was in MVP talks and stuff a few years ago. Right. So, that's another thing to keep in mind. One player, one of the most polarizing in fantasy this season, who, again, I think a lot of fantasy analysts are fading more so than targeting and saying that they're targeting. There's way more fantasy analysts saying that they're fading. And that's Alexander Mattison. Do you see him as a fade or a target? And if you see him as a fade, do you think that there's a chance, because this has sort of been in my brain for a little while, do you think there's a chance that fantasy analysts are kind of taking a stand, and when they take a stand, they want to go a little bit hard with that stance, with a Mattison, and so they're saying, I don't like Mattison this year, which is fine. I totally understand that. I don't like Mattison this year. He's my RB 36, right? Or something like that. Do you think that people are going maybe a little bit too far with that?
I think that's definitely too far. And it's just going too far because and this is kind of the problem with rankings just to begin with. Even if, all right, beginning of the offseason, I truly believe Darren Waller, tight end 3 behind only Kelsey and Andrews. I'm not trying to hurt myself, pat my own back, but that's just what I believed in, May and June. Why would I rank him as a tight end 3 when ADP and the whole public's treating him as a tight end 7, tight end 8, and I can just get him at that price? That's why ADP matters with this. It's not that it needs to be, you need to be a slave to ADP or anything like that, but just being able to get the guy you want at a cheaper price than you would otherwise, that's all we're trying to do there. So with Mattison, RB 36 is absurd because if you could get multiple rounds of value on the guy going as an RB 20, why would you not take that, just discount there? But just in terms of his expectations for this year, the one thing that got missed, I think, in the whole kind of analysis, first of all, we were using, all those games, and it always kills me, JJ, because they always say the last, 5 games that he got to play, and they leave out the spot start where he was the RB 47 because it doesn't fit the narrative.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
He got the 6 spot starts over the years, and I will say, in that one dud, it was because Amir Abdullah used to be a bit of a thorn in his side, stealing some of that pass down work. Maybe Ty Chandler could be that this year, but the bigger issue that really impacted Dalvin last year, it wasn't Dalvin's, his success rate or his EPA per rush. The whole Dalvin is just completely washed narrative. I don't know. He looked pretty fine taking that screen 60 yards to the house against the Colts. He had several pretty awesome plays last year, and I didn't quite see what everyone else was saying there. The big issue was Kevin O'Connell coming over from a Sean McVay offense that really doesn't keep the running backs involved in the passing game. And we saw that play out immediately last year. Rams were 32nd in targets for running backs, and the Vikings were 27th. So I get it. You got Justin Jefferson, you got Cooper Kupp, throw those guys the ball. Now we had Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, highest paid tight end in NFL history. Crazy to say that out loud. But with Mattison, man, I just don't think he is going to be this feature part of the offense. So could he finish up as a borderline RB1 and beat his ADP? Yeah, but I wasn't looking at him, in round 5, round 6 as someone one that I'm going to come back to in December and January saying like, my God, how did I miss out on this league winning player? So for me, in that range of the draft, kept pounding wide receivers. I had Madison ranked ahead of guys like Cam Akers and Miles Sanders in that range, but I thought the general answer to which RB to take out of that range was just no, based on the rest of the roster construction going on right there. So again, similar to Najee, could Madison get there from just being the lead back and maybe a pretty damn good scoring offense? Like, yeah, but we can say that about so many running backs. We can say that about the RB3s going, 4 or 5 rounds after him. So again, just my general roster construction, I tried to get 1, maybe 2 RBs in the first 3 rounds. And at that point, man, I was waiting for the Brian Robinsons, the Samaje Perines, the Antonio Gibsons of the world, because I just didn't think the Madison tier really deserved to be going that much far ahead of him.
Yeah. I mean, look, you're describing the running back dead zone, right? In essence, you're describing this idea that these players are not that much different in the RB2 range versus the RB3 range, and sometimes even the RB4 range. And from a ceiling perspective, yeah, there are outs, but there are outs for a lot of guys. You mentioned the Washington backfield. I think the Washington backfield is really, really interesting because not only can they be, values just on their own standalone, but they have that contingent upside. If the other gets hurt, then if Antonio Gibson gets hurt, Brian Robinson might see more receiving work than we're expecting. Or if Brian Robinson gets hurt, Antonio Gibson now sees more early down work / maybe some more goal line work. There are outs for these players in these situations, in these muddied backfields. And that's why I always preach to target these ambiguous backfields because, the projection might not look amazing or as good as what an Alexander Mattison projection looks, but the Alexander Mattison projection is under the assumption that no one else in that backfield is really touching the ball or getting a big workload. And then, there's obviously the potential for Madison to just be bad and them to move on to Ty Chandler, give him more work. They got Myles Gaskin. Maybe they give Myles Gaskin some work. So yeah, I mean, the precedent is certainly not there for Madison. If anyone wants to hear the pro argument for Madison, Sigmund Bloom had a really good argument on the Perspective show, the first one that I did, where, he basically said, all of the historical comps, because some of the historical comps that I came up with that I, researched, that of these veteran running backs who didn't do that much during the first 4 or 5 years of their career, and then they step into this role, and they all of a sudden are supposed to get a lot of work. Those guys don't really exist in terms of them thriving, right? It's like Toby Gerhart and Mike Davis from last year. It's just a lot of that going on within these backfields. And so, or I guess it might have been a couple years ago with Mike Davis, but regardless, a lot of that going on with these running backs. And the one thing that Bloom said that I do think is pretty interesting is that if you look at the way that teams are spending at the running back position, it has shifted. If you're comparing this versus 2010, and because of the way that they're paying running backs now, maybe that's part of the reason why those guys weren't necessarily, doing much or thriving or what have you, is because the investment is just different in the way that they're, relying on these backs. And now they're saying, oh, we don't need to spend on running back. We're just going to get an Alexander Mattison type for a few $1 million or whatever he's getting paid. Yeah. And then all of a sudden he is actually the featured back. So there's sort of the front office argument in the way that some of those historical comps might not matter. I still think that they matter to some degree. I think there's a reason why, Tony Pollard, Alexander Mattison, if you want to make that comp, Pollard was able to dig into one of the better running backs in football in Ezekiel Elliott, throughout his early in his career, whereas Madison wasn't able to do that with the Dalvin Cook, to the same degree, right? And so,
well, and it's also just real quick, like Khalil Herbert's another guy where even though he wasn't the starter, like he had really good underlying efficiency numbers, as did Pollard. Not Madison. Those games everyone references, man, like I got him up right here: 24 touches, 32 touches, 32 touches, 25 touches, and 16 touches. I don't see Madison flirting with 25 touches a week in this offense. That's probably going to have to keep, throwing the football and try to keep up with a likely porous defense again. We'll see what happens there. But yeah, I mean, unless you're playing like a point per hurdle leagues, man, I just don't think Madison's giving you like exactly what you need in that efficiency basis. So middling talent, and I get it. We can talk about talent not overly mattering at running back. So again, like all these, any top 50, top 75 player like has a path to success. That's why they're ranked where they are in ADP and all of our rankings as well. But to me, man, like if you're not checking 4 of the 5 boxes out there, which I'm not sure Madison is, that's why, he's getting more of the fade for me. But hey, Sigmund, obviously legend in our industry, very
Sure.
smart guy. Justin Boone's another guy that I went on his podcast with The Score. And, he's saying Madison's his like breakout player, and he's listing a lot of good reasons that was kind of making me scared of being underweight on him. So definitely one of those, maybe defining players. But again, I just don't know that his best case upside is better than a borderline RB1. We'll see if I'm wrong.
Yeah, look, I see with Madison, just to kind of close this out and close out the Madison, because I feel like I bring him up on every podcast. I just think he's so interesting because everyone's going to have sort of like a different perspective on him and stuff. But, the thing with Madison, like I have him ranked within the position, not far off from where others might have him ranked within the position. So I'm sort of at market within the running back position itself. But as you noted, I've been drafting the same way as you. In that range of the draft, there are so many good wide receivers. So many good wide receivers that could break out. You're getting like a Jahan Dotson type or a George Pickens type or a Deontay, wherever he ends up, because these guys are ranging with where they get drafted, whether you're looking at more of a homely draft or a best ball draft, what have you. Regardless, there's just a lot of good wide receivers that are being drafted there. That's my issue almost more than anything else, is that, Madison, probably mostly just an average running back that could get some volume, might be okay. But I'm just more concerned about the wide receivers I'm missing out on there, because I think wide receiver just matters a lot more than people realize in fantasy football. Let's move to another backfield. One that I think is also probably, at least with Madison, we have a feel for how much volume he might get week 1. This backfield, I have no freaking idea how it's going to unfold. And that's the Philadelphia Eagles backfield. You got DeAndre Swift. You got Rashad Penny. You got Kenneth Gainwell getting a lot of hype over the last month. How are you reading this backfield? Number one, have you been targeting anyone in this backfield? And then number two, how are you just reading this, and how do you think it's going to be split?
Gainwell is my 6th highest drafted running back.
Okay.
He's always been the guy, and it definitely slowed down a little bit as he got pushed up like to round 11 or 12 there by the end of it. But being able to get him in those final few rounds of drafts was a treat there in June and July. All these June, July drafts, I love bringing up the good things that happen, not the Tim Patrick 20% exposure I have, just wasting away now every time I look at it. But to me, just again, the thing that got me, and it's not necessarily looking that way, but we're not getting that many views. Like, I always thought Rashad Penny would just be the best 1-for-1 replacement for Miles Sanders. Because if Swift isn't getting that early down work, man, like, what are we doing? And just the assumption, everyone's saying, oh, they're in the Eagles offense. Like, look how great of an offense this is for running backs. Like, not really, man. Yeah. They're incredible in real life, obviously. But as we know, fantasy football is different than real life. They're ranked 27th in PPR points per game expected for their running backs last year. We see this in Buffalo. We see this in Baltimore. We see it in Seattle to varying degrees. When you got these dual threat quarterbacks, I know you did a really good study on this in the summer. Like, guess what? The quarterbacks, they scramble instead of checking down. And then once you get inside the 5-yard line, especially with Jalen Hurts literally leading the NFL in rushing touchdowns, if you include playoffs over the past 2 years, like, Detroit is a more fantasy-friendly RB offense than Philly, because Jared Goff is checking the ball down with the first sign of pressure. And no, he's not taking off inside the 5-yard line like a Jalen Hurts. So again, I know it's kind of weird in our heads to think about a team like the Eagles being like a bottom 10 offense in terms of their RB usage, but that's what we see, man. And then when you add actually just the not knowing who's exactly going to be having the roles and having 3 parties involved, there's not quite as many outs I think people think with these guys. So yes, DeAndre Swift, I've seen the underlying usage and the missed tackles force numbers and all that, but I will say too, like, he did get to face, boxes that didn't have 8+ defenders in them at the highest rate of like any qualified running back last year. And as much as I like to think that like you and me, JJ, know a decent amount about this game, we can't all be in love with the Lions offense and what they're doing over there. And then out the other side of our mouth be like, yeah, but they were just wrong on DeAndre Swift and all this. So like, what'd they trade? Like a 2025, like 4th or 5th round pick?
It was bad.
Like,
yeah, not a lot. Yeah.
It wasn't a lot. So as much as we can talk about Rashad Penny's like not getting, $600K guaranteed or something, like Kenneth Gainwell played ahead of Miles Sanders in the fucking Super Bowl, man. Yeah. So yeah, maybe that matters a little bit more than the 2025 5th round pick that Nick Sirianni didn't even know he has. So I have drafted some of Swift, especially more in August when he kind of got down to that RB3 range. But man, when he was just getting that bona fide like top 20 treatment early on, would not touch that with a 10-foot pole. So I'm in wait and see mode. I'm advising anyone that does have, a Swift or a Gainwell or a Penny, if it's at all a close start sit question, give me the other guy for now, because because, again, the most likely answer might just be Jalen Hurts and these wide receivers and Dallas Goedert, because if we're splitting this baby up 3, God forbid, even 4 ways, maybe against the Giants, we'll get Boston Scott more involved there. If that's what we're doing here, again, already less meat on the overall backfield bone than I think people give it credit for. Really, really need this to be condensed to 1, maybe 2 running backs with a dual threat quarterback like Hurts.
Yeah, that's my take too. I've had the most exposure to Kenneth Gainwell. I've had some randomly to Penny, randomly to Swift. I've been on record saying that I liked Penny's this is back in early August, that I liked Penny's ADP more than Swift's ADP. But as I started drafting, I noticed that there were some drafts, like individual drafts, where Swift would drop. Like Swift would fall enough where I'm like, sure, why not? I'll take this chance and see what happens. But I do think you nailed it with the storyline that's sort of like undocumented, just not talked about enough with DeAndre Swift, is no one's asking the question, why did the Lions replace DeAndre Swift with a better version of DeAndre Swift? Why, why did they give him up for peanuts and go out and get Jahmyr Gibbs with a first round, 12th overall pick? I think you at least have to ask that question too. It's no different than when a team gets rid of a really good player, like when the Lions got rid of Kenny Golladay, and everyone's like, "Well, Kenny Golladay is such a good receiver." Well, maybe they knew what they were doing right there.
Are we getting some Dalton Schultz slander, JJ?
Yeah,
I'm here for it if we are. Yeah. $6 million, and the Cowboys said no, but now he's going to lead the Texans in targets. Miss me with that shit.
All right. Speaking of the Cowboys, how do you like that transition?
Hey, there you go. That's why they pay you the big bucks.
That's why they pay me the big bucks. So the Cowboys have Brandon Cooks. I saw that Brandon Cooks was more of an avoid for you than a target. I don't want to strictly say, I never want to corner analysts and say that you've avoided this guy no matter what, because I don't think that's fair. So I know that he's more of an avoid for you than a target. And the reason I want to bring this up is because about a month ago, I had Rich Rebar on the show, and Reebs said, the opposite, that he was someone who he thought was a really safe bet, at least, in those middle rounds, given that he's performed well when he's had good quarterback play and such. So I like that there's different perspectives here. I'm not throwing you in this pit against Reebs to battle it out. That's not what this is about at all. I just want differing perspectives on this stuff, hence the name of this show, right? So talk to me about Brandon Cooks. Why is he more of an avoid for you?
Love my guy Reeves. Got to get back together in these Ohio poker streets that we always got going on. But with Cooks, man, I just see a guy that, he's had a fantastic 10-year career and he's still 29 or whatever. But there are a lot of miles on that odometer. And he gets such a pass for not being good last year because of the bad quarterback situation, even though he was a lot better the year before in the very same quarterback situation. So yes, was coming back from an injury, but we did, even when he was healthy, see Nico really start eating into things there. And just coming into this offense, man, I don't think it's a given that he's going to out-target Michael Gallup. I understand Cooks has been the far superior wide receiver over the last 10 years, but playing for 2023, man, we have a wide receiver that's going to be 30 before too long in a run first offense that, hey, last year, still only 25th pass rate over expected. Maybe McCarthy's, March comments about wanting to run the damn ball more come true. Maybe they don't. But the big thing here is, ever since Micah Parsons really came into the fold and the Cowboys started getting this dominant defense, that's really why Dak Prescott hasn't been the fantasy world beater. It's not 2020 or even 2019 or 2020 anymore, where the Cowboys just got to keep their foot on the gas for 60 minutes. We're seeing a lot more of an effort to run the football. So with Cooks, man, I just feel like speed's kind of the first thing to go sometimes with these receivers. Not everyone could be D-Jacks and still, toasting these guys till they're 35. And I just think, with Cooks going in that wide receiver 4 range, I was just more willing to take some of the more youthful upside options like Elijah Moore, like Quentin Johnston, who else was going there? So sometimes if I already had, if I was trying to build a Dak stack or trying to do the week 17 bullshit, so happy we don't have to talk about that anymore. But trying to do that stuff, I throw Cooks on there. I do think he deserved to be in that tier of guys, but just wasn't someone I wanted to prioritize. I thought the gap between him and Michael Gallup was a bit unwarranted. So yeah, it is one of these situations where, when he scores a 60-yard touchdown Sunday night, I'm going to be definitely questioning the process a little bit more there. But it's an offense that I just don't think is going to be in a ton of shootouts. He is clearly the number 2 option. And again, wouldn't be surprised if he's even more of a 2A and Gallup being the 2B.
Yeah, one of the things that I will throw out there with Cooks, I've been maybe a little bit higher, but not much, versus the market. But one of the things that I will say that's negative about him is that if you look at historical ADP trends, older wide receivers in the middle rounds, so I'm looking at round 6 to round 9, middle round wide receivers who are older, who are past The players who really exceed ADP expectation are year 1 and year 2 guys, right? So rookies and second year guys, and then year 5 and year 6 guys, which a lot of people have questioned, like, why is that the case? I think a lot of it is they switch teams because their rookie contract's up, or, it could just be the fact that they're in their 5th and 6th year and they're sort of like unsexy names like Christian Kirk last year, or even Christian Kirk this year, where they're just these unsexy names that, could still play well. It's just that people are sick of drafting them. They're just over them, right? And so year 5 and year 6 guys do really, really well. And then as you get to these older players, eventually and Mike Evans, you can almost throw in this bucket too, to some degree, but you have to ask yourself, why is this player who is a veteran in the league, who has a history of performing well, why is the market doing this with this player? Michael Thomas, another example. Why is the market doing this with this player? And it could be because the player is just not going to be some league winning guy. And I don't think we're going to look back on the season and say that Brandon Cooks is a league winner. And so at the end of the day, it's probably a safe enough bet to say, the question I always ask is this guy going to burn me if I pass him? I don't think Brandon Cooks is going to burn you. No. I don't know if he's going to be.
He's great for the Cowboys' real life offense.
Yeah.
Like, especially you watch that 49ers game, really the last 2 years. Like, they never replaced Cooper. Obviously, we can get into that another day. But like, even past Cooper though, who can go deep. CeeDee Lamb can go deep, but like, they tried having Devin Smith a few years ago. Like, they haven't really had that field stretching wide receiver on the outside that can, at a minimum, get that safety, take a second glance over before just completely, putting their attention on CeeDee Lamb. So really good real life upgrade. And we've seen Brandon Cooks do that throughout his career. But, some of these field stretcher options, like, is Cooks going to be that different than our guy DPJ going a bit later? I don't know. We'll find out. So again, great real life option, but maybe it's the pessimism I am a Cowboys fan, sadly. Now, just before you guys freak out on me, like, I started watching football in 2001. So I've seen 3 freaking playoff wins, which freaking sucks. But with the Cowboys, their biggest offseason transactions have been adding a near 30-year-old wide receiver, a 32-year-old cornerback. They didn't give up very much for him. In the past, I would have expected those to be huge contracts, throwing away day 1, day 2 picks. And then it's like the head coach doing the token last resort. My butt's on the hot seat, so I'm going to take over play calling. Like, those are 3 decent enough red flags. Again, caveats, they didn't spend that much on Cooks or Gilmore. But I do wonder, man, if just like, this team that's won 12 games in back-to-back years, I do wonder if the Cowboys being a little bit overhyped because, again, the holes they're trying to fill, I didn't think the play calling hole even existed, to be fair. And then also with Cooks and Gilmore, maybe, just maybe, would have been a lot cooler to have them on the squad in 2019.
Yeah, to me, Cooks has been someone that I've targeted if I went running back heavy for whatever reason, because I try to have different structures and stuff to my sure. lineups, or if I'm in a deeper league where with a lot of starting lineup spots where I know that I'm going to just need some production. It's a lot easier to get a guy like Cooks, who I think is going to give you some production. But again, I think we're both agreeing at least that he's probably not going to be some league winning player. But the last question I want to ask you is about league winning players. Give me one guy, one player who you think could win people leagues this year.
I'll go someone we haven't talked about, because I do think, someone like a Tajay Spears is coming on late once Henry falls off. Like, again, if you're fading Henry, you should be kind of high on the other scenario of Henry busts. That would be Tajay Spears. So I am going to, what if the 2023 version of 2022 Jamal Williams is still Jamal Williams over there in New Orleans, especially early on, man. Like, it is setting up so well for him to explode out of the gate. Kamara's suspension. Obviously, we got Kendre Miller dealing with a hamstring injury after already having, a banged up training camp. Like, I feel like we got the Kareem Hunt report and we almost just accepted that. And then we haven't reverted our brains back to realizing Kareem Hunt is not on this roster. And my God, I've been blabbering about the Saints DST for the last month. Like, their schedule to start the year, these first 8-9 games. I mean, I think I saw Adam Levitan actually shout out just the potential for the Saints to really have a nice little stretch here of undefeated football, just based on the kind of QBs they're going to be playing. So a lot of positive game script and offense led by Derek Carr, who, no, not expecting him him to, be a Matt Stafford type jump and take him to the Super Bowl or anything. But we've seen Carr with weapons around him, which they do have, lead top 10 offenses before. And if Jamal Williams can just be that, again, RB4 who has double-digit rushing touchdown upside on his own, and then boom, bell cow, like every down workhorse potential if the running backs leave, I think that's his out there. Because again, I drafted a ton of him last year under the assumption he could be maybe the 2022 version of 2021 James Conner. That didn't really happen. Like Swift got hurt and they kept using Craig Reynolds and Justin Jackson was the other guy on pass downs, but Jamal scored so many touchdowns it didn't matter. If you do go back to his days in Green Bay, like when Aaron Jones did miss a couple games over the years, Jamal got that 80-90% snap rate and really did good things with it. So got like $8 million guaranteed in the running back market where nobody can get anything. Just a fun guy to root for, the twerk god. I do think, in that RB4 range, like really you're getting past the Washington backs. You're getting past the Samaje Perines of the world. Jamal Williams has stood out to me like really amongst these other handcuffs as having the best chance of standalone value and potential boom value down the road.
Yeah, man. I mean, you mentioned it too with Kendre Miller's injury. I think that there's a lot to like, especially if you went with a 0 RB build, with Jamal Williams. Ian, man, it was great to talk to you. Why don't you let everyone know where they can find you and your amazing meme ability over on Twitter?
Great talking to you, JJ. Appreciate it, man. One of, if not the best in the industry, dude. So truly and over here. But yeah, man, at Hartitz on Twitter X, whatever the hell you want to call it, trying to, have a little bit of fun while we just grind fantasy football all the time. Like, remember, we are just floating on a rock that floats around a ball of fire at the end of the day. We don't need to be so serious about everything. But yeah, fantasylife.com. We got a newsletter, we got rankings, we got content, we got podcasts, and all of it is absolutely free. So looking out for you guys, myself, Joey McFarland, Kendall Valenzuela, Holt squad over there. Love each and all of them. And yeah, man, end of the day, week 1 is here, JJ. Let's go. No longer are we doing takes based on stuff that happened 7 months ago. Actual live football, man. And I cannot wait to watch it.
I can't wait either. And by the way, Fantasy Life, shout out to you guys, the tools and such and the content that you guys are pushing out there. Super, super awesome. And it's all free. So you guys should check it out over on fantasylife.com. You can find my stuff over on lateround.com. I'm on Twitter, on X, whatever you want to call it. I say that on every show at this point. At Late Round QB. Make sure you're following the Late Round Fantasy Football Instagram at Late Round FF. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in.